Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Nora Wong. Today's topic is Prices on Your Mind, Using Economics to Understand Inflation, Tariffs, and Junk Fees. And joining me today is my co-host, James Hansberg. Hi, James.
Hi, Nora. Great to see you.
Can you introduce us to our guest today?
Absolutely. Anne Catherine Fay is a vice president in the Boston office of the economic consulting firm Analysis Group. Anne Catherine applies her background in economics and finance to solve complex issues in litigation and business matters. She has consulted clients in the United States and Canada on a variety of engagements involving allegations of anti-competitive behavior and other antitrust matters, securities and finance-related litigation, and strategy and arbitration matters. In the ABA Antitrust Law section, Anne Catherine was appointed in 2022 to serve as counsel to the chair of the section, Fiona Schaefer, for the 2023 to 2024 section year. Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, Anne Catherine.
Thank you both for having me back on this podcast. I'm glad to reconnect with my good friend, Honora, and it's great to meet you, James.
Absolutely. Great to meet you as well. So, Anne Catherine, let's talk for a couple minutes about your recent role as counsel to the chair of the ABA's antitrust section. In this position, you played an essential role in all of Fiona Schaefer's initiatives for the section, with particular focus on co-organizing events and facilitating dialogue on antitrust and consumer protection issues related to two of the most important topics of our day, artificial intelligence and sustainability. Can you briefly explain what it means to serve as counsel to the chair and what primary responsibilities of the role entail?
Sure. Well, serving as counsel to the section's chair is a unique opportunity where you get to interact with brilliant legal minds and exchange on some of our most pressing issues in antitrust, consumer protection, and data privacy. It's often said that as counsel to the chair, you're acting as the chair's chief of staff. And in terms of responsibilities, you are part of pursuing the chair's goals, including appointing over 500 leaders to various committees and task forces, developing a range of virtual and in-person programs, including conferences both in and outside the U.S., and closely managing day-to-day activities with the section staff and the big ABA. So the responsibilities seem endless, but it all depends on what the chair asks of her counsel.
Thank you for that helpful overview. Sounds like you've had a busy couple of years. And I understand you made a bit of history in this role as you were the first economist to serve as counsel to the chair. As the first economist to hold this position, what were your expectations coming into the role, and did anything surprise you?
To be honest, I had no expectations. And no one had fully explained to me what the role entailed, except for saying, well, you get to work in a highly visible capacity with the section chair. I said, okay. Well, in hindsight, I can tell you that anything I had heard prior to coming to the role was nothing compared to the reality. As the first economist in this role, I was just fortunate to be able to share a different outlook and discuss viewpoints from an economic perspective in rooms full of lawyers.
I think that's really helpful. And James, you hinted at this already. This is like a commitment of multiple years of work. And let's not underestimate how demanding the job is. Now, coming out at the other end of the tunnel, what were the most important takeaways that you get from working on this job for 3 years? Is that right, Anne Catherine?
To clarify, it's actually a 2-year term while you're still holding down your day job. Mm-hmm. The first year is the planning year during which leadership appointments are made. The chair's themes are selected and the events and programs are scheduled and agreed upon. And so the second year is just execution year. So it's a 2-year term. And to discuss takeaways, I have to touch on the themes Fiona Schaefer, then section chair, had selected for her leadership years. As you mentioned earlier, James, these included the intersection of AI and antitrust and the intersection of sustainability and antitrust. I would say, besides interacting with amazing professionals, our work on these themes has been some of our most important takeaways. As you know, both AI and sustainability are dynamic issues that have undergone rapid changes in the past decade. In the case of AI, we've actually seen the arrival of generative AI platforms like ChatGPT during my tenure, and the development of predictive algorithms showing us the stages of how AI can be leveraged by businesses and consumers in their day-to-day. So we're seeing global antitrust agencies aiming to develop guidelines around the development and use of generative AI models. And I think AI will likely remain a top issue given its widespread impact on everyday life. The same could be said about sustainability. Antitrust agencies around the world have either developed or are discussing alliances among businesses with sustainability goals. And we did some great work with experts like Harvard professor Peter Tufano, looking at the landscape of collaboration agreements in the US, Europe, and other countries where enforcement has played out in different ways. For example, in Europe and Australia, antitrust agencies have been making progress in updating their competition guidelines to provide guidance on collaboration agreements that support sustainability initiatives. However, in the US, let's just say the debate around climate alliances and or sustainability has become a highly politicized issue, and we should expect further developments in this space.
Thank you, Anne-Catherine. That's really interesting and appreciate your perspective and experience on those issues. Now, we're going to dive into a discussion of some of the key antitrust issues that may be on the horizon. From your vantage point, other than the AI and sustainability issues that you just discussed, what do you think lies ahead in 2025 and beyond?
That's a great question. If we just take a look at the news headlines, one of the common themes that has come up time and time again is price control and prices in general, ranging from interest rates to inflation, tariffs, and cost pass-through. But all these buzzwords really all boil down to potential price increases. I'm not one to predict the future, but I just think prices, among other salient issues, will likely remain top of mind this year and the near future.
That's really helpful. And for our listeners, especially the lawyers who may not be as skilled in economics as you, could you explain the concept of cost pass-through and its significance for consumers and a tool in antitrust analysis?
Sure. So imagine a business facing higher cost, perhaps because of supply chain disruptions or an increase in labor expenses, or even a new regulation, aka a government-imposed tariff. The question is, who ultimately bears that cost? This is where cost pass-through comes in. Simply put, it's just the extent to which a business passes increased costs to consumers through higher prices or absorbs them, cutting into its own margins. For lawyers and economists, cost pass-through matters in antitrust and regulatory law. Think about price-fixing cases where you ask how much of an overcharge gets passed down the supply chain. Or think about consumer protection issues where you ask where and when do price hikes actually become unfair or deceptive. Even for litigation over damages, the issue often relates to whether and how costs were passed through.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that overview. And from a big picture perspective, where do we see cost pass-through manifest itself in our daily lives?
It's basically everywhere. And so any type of consumer good or service is subject to cost pass-through. For businesses, it's a pricing decision, but for consumers, it's a cost of living issue. And I can point to at least a couple of examples that are making headline. When a new tariff is imposed, businesses decide whether to absorb the cost or raise prices, which can impact everything from car importations to grocery prices. And something else, a business that faces higher marginal costs can either transparently pass them to consumers, directly increasing its prices, or bury them in fine print fees or junk fees, which I think most of us have faced.
Now, having talked conceptually or hypothetically, now can we get into some real world examples pertinent to cost pass-through? And then as a consumer, I guess, where can I see some key indicators that a business have passed costs onto consumers?
Yes, because cost pass-through is everywhere in the economy, there are many real-world examples. For instance, transportation companies adding fees when fuel prices go up, grocery or retailer price hikes when they face rising production or labor costs, as we mentioned earlier, and banking and service fees when financial institutions raise fees in response, say, to a new regulation or market conditions. Similarly, there are many indicators of cost pass-through. As a consumer, you might see higher prices at checkout on goods and services, or face added costs like airline baggage fees or restaurant service charges. That said, and because I also work on finance matters, I know that companies sometimes disclose pricing strategies in earning reports and public statements, which can then provide another indicator of cost pass-through.
That's all very helpful. And then, but to put it even in simpler terms, is there a link between inflation and cost pass-through?
Yes, absolutely. Inflation and cost pass-through are closely connected. So during high inflation periods, cost pass-through is often more common because businesses across industries experience rising costs simultaneously. So we can have a cycle where higher costs lead to higher prices, which can further drive inflation. However, the extent of pass-through will depend on many factors because some industries can pass costs more easily than others. And so you can think of cost pass-through as a response to inflation.
That's very helpful. And Catherine, and thinking about how to apply this concept in practice, what is the value of analyzing inflation and tariffs and junk fees through the lens of cost pass-through? And what insights can be gained from applying this concept in our work?
I can give you a practical example related, let's say, to class certification issues. And I can also cite to public literature that might be helpful to our listeners. For instance, in a class certification case, the focus is whether the alleged harm affected all proposed class members in the same way. And since cost pass-through helps us understand the relationship between changes in a firm's cost and price changes for consumer goods and services, it can potentially be used to assess alleged overcharges for products where there are a small group of consumers or purchasers and there are few or no alternative products. So, for example, if cost pass-through was consistent across the proposed class, plaintiffs can argue for uniform harm, right, supporting certification. Conversely, if cost pass-through was variable across the proposed class, then defendants can argue that impact varies across the class, making individual issues dominant over common ones. So that's a practical example related to class certification issues. But I think analyzing inflation and tariffs through the lens of cost pass-through is helpful in a sense because it helps us with understanding who actually bears the financial burden, either businesses, consumers, or suppliers. By looking into how much of a cost increase gets passed down, we can learn more about, say, pricing power. So which industries, companies can pass costs easily. We can learn more about consumer impact, how cost increases translate into higher prices for households. And finally, perhaps we can learn more about legal implications, how businesses justify price increases and whether they raise antitrust and unfair pricing concerns. And related to that, the Wall Street Journal recently published an article titled "How Much Do Tariffs Raise Prices?" that details the variation in pass-through rates for different consumer goods, in this case based on recently imposed tariffs. The main findings show minimal cost pass-through on goods with numerous substitutes, like tablecloth and consumer apparel, and higher cost pass-through on goods with few to no alternatives for premium products like smartphones and higher priced items like cars.
That's all very helpful, but higher prices can come in multiple ways. One of them is in junk fees, and that's not very well understood as a term that we use. Could you explain what junk fees are and why they matter? And sorry for the multiple questions, but what impact do they have on consumers and competition?
Sure. I think I mentioned earlier that probably most of us have faced junk fees. Junk fees are essentially hidden charges attached to goods and services. They are unexpected fees which obscure the true price and prevent comparison shopping. One of the main reasons junk fees will be relevant going into 2025 is related to consumer protection issues. We know that in December 2024, the FTC finalized the rule on unfair or deceptive fees, which is commonly known as the junk fees rule, targeting hidden and misleading fees in the live event ticketing and short-term lodging industries. So the ruling by the FTC made it clear that it's not about banning or removing junk fees, but instead it's about promoting transparency on the upfront cost and fees for products and services.
Yeah, as you said, the tricky thing about junk fees is that it's hidden. So, right, as a consumer, it might be a little difficult to spot it. But can you share a practical example of where individuals might encounter or experience junk fees in their day-to-day lives?
Yes, there are numerous examples of junk fees, unfortunately. For example, hidden fees at hotels or short-term accommodation, service charges for event tickets, early termination fees, even if you've already paid for the service, think cable, for instance. Classic example of junk fees, often cited in the literature, is bank overdraft fees. So imagine you accidentally overdraw your checking account by just a couple dollars. You may be charged a hefty overdraft fee, even if the transaction was small.
I think you already mentioned that the FTC finalized the rule on unfair or deceptive fees, right? So anything comes out of that other than this needs to be more transparent?
You can think of it from the consumer perspective or the business perspective. From a consumer perspective, transparency is obviously important. And I can perhaps discuss like a hypothetical. Let's just say you see a ticket advertised for $50, right? You click through to purchase it. When you get to checkout, the total price is suddenly $72. And so where did that extra $22 come from? Well, you see a service fee of $10, a processing fee of $7, and a venue fee of $5. And prior to the recent FTC ruling on junk fees, these additional costs were added at the last step in your purchase, making it more difficult for consumers to compare prices and different options. But from a business perspective, I think it means clearly disclosing all costs upfront, right? So simply put, disclosing the total price, including all mandatory fees upfront when displaying options. It also means competitive pricing pressure for businesses, which would now be competing on true cost when all fees are visible. And the FTC ruling will likely have an impact on businesses that provide goods and services where consumers have viable substitutes, for instance, hotels, versus goods and services where consumers have few to no alternatives. For instance, flights are still the preferred choice for long-distance travel. I think the theme of substitution comes up in both junk fees and, as we discussed earlier, in cost pass-through. For products with many competitors in the market, there is just minimal cost pass-through, given that consumers can easily find alternatives. But with the elimination of junk fees, consumers can also easily compare prices across alternatives.
That's really helpful. Can I ask a follow-up question? So I remember in law and econ classes, we were taught about something like deadweight loss, or we were trying to analyze things that's like, basically a loss and no one is getting benefit out of it. In terms of like not having the transparency desired, like having the junk fees put in place and the consumer doesn't know it, and then you sometimes feel like, gotcha. Is there a loss of some sort on a societal level?
Potentially, but as most economists would say, it all depends on so many different factors. You'd have to analyze the issue by sector, by industries, by specific companies involved in having those junk fees either passed on to consumers or just out there as a point of competition.
That's really helpful. I think the point I'm trying to get to is that, as you said, right, like with transparency, business would be competing at true cost, right? And consumers would be considering things at their true cost. Without that transparency, I think, could you say that there has been a higher search cost, right, to find the right price point for the right decisions?
Yes, absolutely. I think junk fees does not easily allow for comparison shopping because you have to go through so many different steps to understand the true cost of goods and services.
Well, this is all fascinating, but I know more discussion on higher prices is probably a little bit too much. Let's switch gears a little bit. We already learned about your job as the council to chair, which is fascinating, but can you tell us something about yourself that people would not know if they had only known you professionally?
Wow. This is a tough question. Do you get to ask this every time?
We do. And sometimes we just enjoy the long pause when people are thinking about it.
Well, okay. So if you only knew me professionally, you might not realize that I have a passion for writing. I love learning words and new languages and just exploring how they shape the way we think, feel, and communicate. This actually helps me in how I approach problem solving in my professional life. Lately, I've been picking up new words in Swahili, including hongera, which means congratulations.
Wow. And where is that language applied in the world?
Mostly Eastern Africa. Think of Kenya, for instance.
Oh, that's great for travels. Is that something inspired traveling? Is that what inspired you to learn new languages?
I'm just a book lover, and I've been reading a lot ever since I've known how to read, basically. And to me, languages, words just have this special means of connecting people, cultures, and countries across the globe.
So thinking back to your role as counsel to the chair, I understand that involves a lot of travel and that you traveled to a number of destinations for programming for the section. Did you have any favorite cities or countries that you traveled to during your tenure as counsel to the chair?
Yes, I love this question. One of my favorite places I traveled to during my tenure as counsel to the chair was Cape Town, South Africa. The city is just stunning with its breathtaking landscapes, rich history, and vibrant culture and people. I'll just never forget the sunset up on Table Mountain. The view from the top was absolutely surreal.
One more reason for people to try to get more involvement with the section. There will be conferences held around the world. So now let's turn to our final segment called Our Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
And Catherine, we're going to ask you to pick a number from 1 to 20, and one of them, each number is going to correspond to a mysterious question. Would you give us your number?
Gosh, number 3.
Number 3. Is there any popular food item that you dislike intensely?
Not really.
That's a
Not
good thing.
really.
You're a foodie. You like all the
I
foods
am a
that you
foodie.
taste.
I love trying out foods. Yeah, I am not a picky eater.
That's great. And I wish my kids were the same way. And Catherine, what's the favorite piece of food that you had while you're in Cape Town?
It was a local dish made of seafood, and I can't recall the name, but it was just absolutely delicious.
Well, again, more reasons to be hanging out with the ABA Antitrust Sections conferences around the world. Thank you, listeners, for listening. Thank you for joining us. And Catherine, this has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust Section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.